I mentioned there that Kristina Keneally, we now know she's the shadow Labor's opposition Home Affairs Minister. She's also got the remit for immigration. She's had varying positions on immigration, almost as many as she's had on boat turnbacks and every other issue to do with border protection. But she has said she'll advocate the economic importance of immigration, so keeping the numbers nice and high. She said it was too early to discuss whether Labor would propose returning to the higher annual immigration intake after Scott Morrison cut it back down. She said, we need to ensure that immigration and citizenship is given the attention it deserves in terms of economic growth and the skills we bring into the country. She's a big Australian girl, isn't she, Terry McCrann?
Well, she's certainly articulated that in the past, Peter. I mean, I think that was a fundamental mistake on the part of the opposition leader to make her the spokesman in the space. Given her past position on the boats, she's effectively a bring back the boats person, and she can deny that now for all she likes. But in an election campaign, that's going to be devastatingly negative for the Labor Party. Apart from anything else, it's going to put them on the back foot. And now to add to that, the commitment indirectly, although she says it's too early to make a specific policy commitment, but indirectly to the big Australia, the big immigration program, I think just compounds the mistake. The whole idea that immigration can drive our economic growth has been put under serious question mark over the reality of what's happened over the last 12 months. We've had very strong immigration, but we have not had very strong economic growth. So, and we've certainly had very weak wages growth. And there's a much stronger argument to be made, and this is something that goes directly to the heart of the Labor Party's appeal or lack of appeal to its own former base. High immigration drives down the level of wages growth in the community because you bring in extra supply, and you bring in, particularly if you bring in extra skilled supply. So this is an anti-base policy from an immigration opposition spokesman who is also very, very weak on boats. I mean, it's a recipe for both political and policy disaster.
Yeah, and Terry's point about growth being diluted by immigration, that's true in overall terms, but it's also very much true in per capita terms too, isn't it, Andrew? And we can see, you know, a concern on the coalition side, on the government side also, is the much lauded entry into cabinet of a population minister, Alan Tudge. Well, that's terrific. But immigration, which is the biggest driver of populations, in a completely different portfolio. So the right hand and the left hand aren't controlled by the same body. And this has always been the issue. And we know before the election campaign, there was a whole debate that Australia needs a population plan. Do you think we're actually going to see a population plan now, after the government's won?
I doubt it. I'm sceptical. In fact, I think it's very unfortunate that the portfolio was, as it was, split up, and this occurred with Scott Morrison's ascension, though it had sort of been partly, there was emphasis muddying the waters around who has responsibility for immigration.
I call it political window dressing to make us think something's happened when it's not going to really happen.
Yes, yeah, no, exactly. I think that's right. So, you know, I think basically the government, there is still further for the government to move here. It has lowered the cap on the permanent migration program, but there's still a lot to be done on getting temporary migration under control, and further reductions in the permanent migration cap would be very useful. That said, the government is being helped here in creating distinction between itself and the opposition because Labor continues to talk about high immigration and its economic benefit. And it's strange again, you know, on the day that the national accounts have come out and shown another quarter where there is no growth per person, after 2 quarters where there was no growth actually growth per person was negative. In fact, to go further, you know, Terry was saying, we've seen over the last 12 months, in other words, that high immigration doesn't drive strong growth. It's over a longer period than that. For most of the Howard government, growth per person was about 2.25%, well, it was over 2.25% when we had an immigration rate about half the rate that we've had for the last dozen years or so. Yet over the last dozen years, that growth per person has been less than 1%, so a much, much lower growth. So that, in fact, the aggregate growth has been, for the whole economy, has been even weaker than it was under Howard when overall growth was higher.
When are we going to learn, Terry? I was down in Melbourne, down your neck of the woods, in the last few days, and I drove down past Geelong to the Bellarine Peninsula to my mum's house. I drove down late one night, and it took me just over an hour and maybe 20 minutes. And I drove down again a couple of days later in peak hour. It took me almost 3 hours on the same little bit of highway because the congestion is just enormous. It's basically all suburbs now from Melbourne to Geelong, people living out there because they can afford homes and commuting into the city, and the infrastructure's just not there. Yet we know Melbourne is now taking more migrants into that city than any other city in the country, including Sydney.
Well, it demands a huge infrastructure spend, but that infrastructure spend then is only chasing its tail. It's only trying to catch up with the population growth. It doesn't actually, which is what we should be getting out of infrastructure, it doesn't actually add to our welfare, either our economic welfare or our broader welfare, because it's just providing, behind the game, infrastructure for the increased population. What it does do, though, and this is where I think we end up getting a corruption of the debate, is it drives asset values, obviously, because more people come in, asset values rise. So the property sector loves high immigration, but the community has to pay for it, and they pay for it both in economic and financial terms, and they pay for it in lifestyle terms.
And remember in the election campaign there was this whole debate about elderly parent visas. The Liberal Party had a cap of 15,000 on these new visas. They were temporary, not permanent, and Labor had them unlimited, and we knew there were about 100,000 plus in the queue. Some demographers said there was 250,000 people in the queue. They would come. Here's a picture of a woman. It's a big story today, a great-grandmother. She's from Britain. She came out to Australia about 11 years ago. Now, she was only ever on a temporary visa. She's 93. She suffered a stroke. She'll cost us about 145,000. It seems very hard-hearted, but the government's saying she needs to be deported because she hasn't got the right to stay here as a permanent migrant. She wasn't on that visa class. This is precisely the reason why you just can't have temporary visas in this class, in my view, because when they get old in a situation like that, your heart goes out, you roll over, you let them all stay, and in the end, you never really have a temporary visa class.